Hi, I'm Alex Guns, the fund manager of the Heptagon Future Trends equity fund, and today we're here to talk about the future of food. The world has an absolutely huge problem, and really it's the following. Think about it like this. Today the world's population is close on 8 billion people. If you take forecasts from the United Nations, then by 2050 we're over 9 billion. By the end of this century we're over 11 billion. So you've got growing demand, but at the same time we have shrinking supply. What we mean by that is basically there are more mouths to feed, but there's less available food. If you think about the stresses on the system, only about 3% of all land on the planet is available for farming today. Given global warming, given soil degradation, that amount is shrinking. We have the similar issues with water as well. We've got climate change exacerbating a lot of these problems, and therefore we need to come up with some intelligent solutions. I think it's very clear that the world really needs to rethink its current model for food provision. And maybe the best way perhaps of framing this is as follows. Today it's really not a sustainable system at all. What I mean by that is, again, if you take data from the United Nations, 75% of the world's food comes from only 5 sources of animal protein and 12 different plants. From a sustainability point of view and from a diversity point of view, that will need to change. So when we try and project into the future, I think there will be a paradigm shift. Historically, we've been very familiar with this notion of a meat aisle, if you will, within supermarkets. In the future, we think this will be a protein aisle. And really to elaborate in terms of what we mean by it, think of it as follows. I think many listeners to this webcast will be familiar with the idea of vegetarian and vegan alternatives to meat. But where we've really got to now is almost the next stage of this process. So we've got really genuine, bona fide plant-based alternatives. In the future, we expect to see insect-based protein feature increasingly in Western diets, and then there's also the whole discussion and opportunity that's afforded by cell-based protein or cell-based lab-grown meat as well. I think the opportunity for plant-based meat alternatives is actually very significant. What is particularly interesting, and I speak both from personal experience and from everything we've read on this topic, is that really for the first time with the current range of plant-based meat alternatives that are on the market, they actually come very, very close, or increasingly close, we should say, to the real thing. Historically, vegetarian and vegan alternatives didn't necessarily do that. And I think really if you're keeping your eye on the prize, then consider the following. You look at the addressable market, about 93% of people in your typical developed world country are omnivores today. They are the people we need to convert to eating protein more sustainably, not the 7% of the population who's vegetarian. So I think how we're going to get there is really as follows. It's basically seeing a broader range of these products, an increasing quality of these products, and more affordable products as well. In terms of the range, I think we've all been very familiar with the notion of plant-based burgers or sausages. What we're seeing now is effectively equivalents of steaks, say of chicken strips, and so on. Even though companies pushing the boundaries, trying to use plant-based solutions to replicate the sensation of certain fishes, the taste and flavour of certain fish products. And really the other stage of how this market is going to grow is simply that with the newer generation or subsequent iterations, they are going to become better products. So lower in salt, cleaner labels on the back, and we think that will only encourage people to get into this potential segment. Today, plant-based protein maybe makes up 1% of the overall protein market, but we've seen growth in this figure of 45% in the last year, and the growth going forward we think is very compelling. I think in the new food revolution, as we said, the notion of the protein aisle will become more and more entrenched. Think of insects, think of cell-based meats as being very complementary to plant-based meat, even if they will represent smaller segments. If we take insects first, I think really there's almost a sort of Western sensibility against insects, or a fear. Globally, the key figure to take away is about 2 billion people in the world already eat insects today. And when you actually look at the case for insects, it's very compelling. The carbon footprint of insects is very, very small. The health benefits are also significant. If you think about it like this, a typical bug might contain about 3 times as much calcium and 5 times as much protein as a conventional source of meat. So we think insects will play an increasingly important role. In terms of cultured meat, we're at a much earlier stage of the evolution. These products have been really developed in labs, in academic settings for the past, say, 10 to 15 years. In some ways it's theoretical, but the idea of having exponential cell growth triggered in bioreactors means that you could have a very sustainable solution. We see a number of companies both in the United States, in Europe, and indeed in Asia too, that are really beginning to push the boundaries. If you go to Singapore today, it's already possible to purchase chicken that's generated from cells. We've seen a number of other interesting startups emerge that are really demonstrating or showcasing their products for the first time, even if they're not yet commercially available. I think there are two very clear barriers. Number one, which I think will only change with time and with attitudes, with better education, is almost just that simple fear factor. It's very hard, at least at the moment, to convince many Western consumers to eat insects. The idea of cell-based meat, perhaps in some people's minds, rings alarm bells of science fiction. But I think better education, better packaging, and particularly with regard to insect protein, if it's, say, ground into a powdered form and then used as an equivalent to flour, that can be very compelling. The second factor is, regardless of what consumers think, it ultimately comes down to cost. And maybe the best way to frame this consideration is really with the following statistic. Typically, if I want to go and buy a 100-gram equivalent of beef today, minced beef, it's going to cost me about 80 US cents. If I want to buy the equivalent weight of plant-based product, it will cost me maybe 4 times that figure. If I want to buy something which is cell-grown, lab-grown, it's going to cost me 1,000 times that figure. And ultimately that will decide or influence many people's purchase decisions. The good news, of course, is that clearly we've seen precedents from other industries, other sectors. As these businesses scale, costs will come down, and that will help grow accessibility. There's been absolutely huge interest in this theme within the last 12 months and even beyond that too. The figure I have in mind is that about $3 billion has been committed to venture capital projects within this area over the last year or so. And globally, there's somewhere between 500 and 600 plant-based and other alternative protein-based businesses starting up in operation today. I think the clearest challenge, of course, for investors is how to identify winners. And given the market opportunity, there may well be multiple winners, but identifying them today is certainly far from easy. There are not so many businesses which are listed. The most obvious one that comes to mind would be Beyond Meat in the United States. There's certainly a number of credible private businesses operating within the space that have established potential early leads in some scale. Impossible Foods in the US, Meatless Farm in the UK might logically spring to mind. Our approach is really one of almost trying to take a step back and saying, look, we have no doubt about the growth prospects within this alternative protein space, but you actually need the building blocks, if you will, the functional ingredients to make these products achievable in the first place. And that's where we think the potentially the best investment opportunities lie. So thank you everyone for listening to our thoughts on the future of food. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to your relevant representative at Heptagon Capital. Thank you.